Today, we're diving into one of the most consequential moments of the 20th century, the birth of the State of Israel in 1948. We're going to look at what the land was like before, the key events that led to its creation, and the immediate fallout that has really defined the Middle East ever since.
So let's start with the day itself, May 14th, 1948. It's a day that holds two completely opposite meanings. For Jewish people, it's Independence Day, a moment of national liberation, the dream of a homeland finally realized after centuries. But for Palestinians, that same day is known as the Nakba, or the catastrophe, a day that marks the beginning of mass displacement and the loss of their homes and land. So that's the big question, right? How can one single event be seen in two such profoundly different ways? To really get to the bottom of this, we need to rewind and look at the land, the people, and the chain of events that set the stage for this historic moment.
Okay, so first things first, let's set the scene. Before Israel, before the British, what was this land actually like? For centuries, it was a territory within the huge, sprawling Ottoman Empire.
And, a lot of historical accounts from that time describe it this way. They paint a picture of a region that was pretty underdeveloped, sort of a forgotten corner in a giant empire that was, frankly, on its last legs.
But that picture is, well, it's incomplete. The land absolutely was not empty. It was home to a well-established Arab population. And, really importantly, there had been a continuous Jewish community living there for centuries. In fact, and this surprises a lot of people, by the middle of the 1800s, the city of Jerusalem actually had a Jewish majority.
All right, now let's jump forward to the early 20th century. This is where things get really complicated, because you have two huge forces on a collision course: a brand new Jewish nationalist movement brewing in Europe, and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which brings a new global power onto the scene. And that movement was Zionism. It grew out of the intense and often violent anti-Semitism in Europe. Thinkers like Theodor Herzl basically argued that assimilation hadn't worked, and the only real solution for Jewish safety was to create their own state, and the place they focused on was their ancestral homeland, the land then known as Palestine.
So after World War I, the entire map of the Middle East gets redrawn. The Ottoman Empire is gone, and the new League of Nations gives Great Britain a mandate, which is basically the authority to govern the territory of Palestine. This shift from Ottoman to British control was a total game changer.
Now, British rule was messy. It was full of contradictions. In 1917, you have the Balfour Declaration, where Britain supports a Jewish national home. At the same time, they'd made promises of independence to Arab leaders. So right away, you've got conflict baked in. For a while, the British allowed Jewish immigration, but as local tensions exploded, they slammed on the brakes with the 1939 White Paper, right on the eve of World War II. By 1947, the situation was unmanageable, and Britain just said, "We're out."
And you can see the impact of that early immigration policy right here. Even with the later restrictions, the Jewish population in the region swelled to around 600,000. This completely changed the demographics on the ground and pretty much forced the international community to get involved. With Britain washing its hands of the problem, the whole question of Palestine gets dumped on the lap of the brand new United Nations. The world was now facing a massive refugee crisis and was under incredible pressure to find some kind of permanent solution.
And of course, looming over all of this was the absolute horror of the Holocaust. Suddenly, the idea of a Jewish state wasn't just a political aspiration. It felt like an urgent moral necessity. You had hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors with nowhere to go, and the idea of a safe haven gained huge international support. So, the UN steps in. It puts together a special committee, they go to the region, they study the situation, and they come back with a really radical proposal: partition. The plan was to split the land into two separate countries, one for Arabs, one for Jews, and to keep Jerusalem as an international city.
The response to this plan could not have been more different. The Jewish leadership, while they weren't thrilled with the borders, accepted the deal. It was a state. But the Arab leaders and all the neighboring Arab nations rejected it completely. For them, dividing the land was simply off the table.
And that rejection was the spark that lit the fuse. Almost as soon as the UN vote happened in late 1947, fighting broke out between Jewish and Arab militias inside Palestine. A full-blown civil war started, all while the British were still technically in charge.
And this brings us right to the climax of our story. A civil war is already tearing the land apart. The British are packing their bags, and the Jewish leadership decides it's time to make a huge, decisive move.
So, on May 14, 1948, literally hours before the British Mandate was set to end, David Ben-Gurion stood up in a museum in Tel Aviv and declared the establishment of the State of Israel. Just like that, a new country was born into a world of chaos.
And that declaration instantly transformed the Civil War into an all-out international war. The very next day, the armies of 5 neighboring Arab countries, Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, Lebanon, and Iraq, invaded. This kicked off the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, which would rage for the next 15 months.
In the middle of all that fighting, something else was happening. Around 700,000 Palestinians became refugees. Now, historians still debate the exact reasons. Some fled the terrible violence, while others were forced out of their homes. But this mass exodus is the heart of what Palestinians call the Nakba.
So by the time the armistice agreements were signed in 1949, the world looked very different. The State of Israel was a new reality on a redrawn map. But the war left behind an unresolved conflict and a massive refugee crisis that would echo for decades to come.
And that really brings us to a final thought. The story of 1948 isn't just dusty old history. It's a living, breathing story that people carry with them today. So the question for us is, how do these powerful, competing stories about a nation's birth, one of independence, one of catastrophe, continue to shape identities, fuel conflict, and impact the world we all live in?